In this new episode of Expat Experts, we have an extraordinary guest, Dr. Julie Pham. Julie is a Cambridge-studied leader focused on leadership development and organizational culture. She is also the founder of CuriosityBased, a consultancy focused on helping organizations foster curiosity to drive growth and innovation. Today, we'll talk with Julie about her experience as an expat, with leadership across different cultures, as well as we will dive on her work with curiosity-based strategies.
This is Expat Experts, the podcast that dives into the fascinating lives of those who've lived and worked across borders, exploring the challenges, experiences, and insights they've gained along the way.
Before we start with the episode, I want to remind to all the listeners that the best way to stay tuned with the latest episodes is by hitting the button on subscribe here in YouTube and your favorite audio platform. For extra information about the podcast and check our one-on-one calls on how to create your own YouTube channel, your own podcast, or become an expat, check the website expatexpertspodcast.com or the link in the description.
The Expat, Julie Pham.
So, in the first part of today's episode, we want to first of all welcome you, Julie, as a guest to Expat Experts. Thank you so much for your time today. Let's talk a little bit about your personal life and your experience as an expat. You have kind of a diverse background. I suppose that shaped you also a little bit around, but and I suppose it also affected your current work and how you deal with leadership. So I think the first question, it's mandatory on which countries have you lived as an expat actually, or how this journey begins.
Yes. So I have lived in England, Germany, France, and Vietnam as an expat.
Wow. Okay. That's not a short list. That's quite some places. So you said Vietnam as the last one, but you are actually coming from a Vietnamese family, as far as I understood.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was born in Vietnam, but I left when I was 2 months old. And so we came to the U.S. as boat people. And so that was in 1979. I grew up in the U.S. My parents never went back. And I actually went back for the first time when I was 22 years old. And so of all those countries that I listed, Vietnam was the country that I lived in the longest as an expat. So I consider it, because I'm American, and when I first came to Vietnam, I was actually learning Vietnamese. So I consider myself an expat in Vietnam, even though I was born there.
Was it the first country that you went?
No, the first country was actually England. So my expat journey is really focused actually around my studies, around my research. So after I graduated from college, I was able to get a scholarship to go to England to get my PhD at Cambridge. And so I spent a few years in the UK, and then in my research, I lived in France, and I lived in, well, actually, it was a relationship that brought me to Germany, and then lots of studies that brought me, and research that brought me to Vietnam. And so I went back and forth in Vietnam over the course of, I think I was there for a total of maybe 4 years on and off in Vietnam.
Okay, not bad. It's when you start feeling like that might become a place that you live like permanently, no? Like, I think there is always this threshold.
Well, and also when I went to England, that was actually my first time using my passport. So growing up, my family and I, we didn't travel. My parents worked all the time, so we didn't go on vacations. And the idea of foreign travel was considered a luxury. And so the first time I went to study was actually the first time I left the country. I'm not counting Canada.
Okay. That's something that I wanted to ask you, actually, if like being daughter of a Vietnamese refugees shape your approach on living outside, like in the sense of like, I mean, I suppose what you just said, the fact of like needing to hard work of your parents and not having too much time to travel. being the first time that you leave the country, it's to live outside of the country. That's already like a shocking experience. But was there anything else that like shape your approach on how
Yes,
to live?
absolutely. Because I think growing up Vietnamese in America, it requires, I'm bicultural. And it requires, so even though actually it was up until age 5, I spoke Vietnamese. And then and I grew up in a time when assimilation was really stressed. And so a lot of kids my age, we stopped speaking our native language once we entered the school system, because a lot of parents stress, oh, we have to assimilate. And, but I mean, even without the language, there was still Vietnamese culture that I had at home, and then being American at school and trying to fit in. And so anytime actually, once I started to live abroad, it was just, oh, it's just the constant adaptation. And I actually have a funny story about when I realized I was a foreigner. So I went to Berkeley for my undergrad, and they had the international house, the I house, and that's where all the international students went. And I remember as an undergrad, I was just, oh, they're kind of weird. They're international students. And then my first year at Cambridge, I think I was in an extracurricular dance class or something, and I was talking to an undergrad. And then he made some remark about me being a foreigner. And I realized, oh, I'm the international student now. And so it's just, I think it's about context and realizing, oh, context changes, which means my identity in that context changed. Because in the US, I'm American and I am the local, and yet that can quickly change just depending on where I am. My identity. Mm-hmm.
Yes, of course. I mean, I suppose also it's bringing this to duality of cultures in your case, no? And it's like, I suppose your parents identify themselves as Vietnamese, and you are the first generation that are there identifying yourself as American, but of course you have a cultural background that it's home. Your parents' influence.
And then also representing and being abroad actually is also representing Asian Americans too, because I think even in Europe, a lot of people think, oh, American means white or black.
White American.
And so I remember when I lived in France, and I would say my name is Julie, which it's actually a French name, Julie, right? I could see people's relief because they saw my face, and this would be in French. So they assume that I'm from Asia, and that I'm going to give them a really difficult to pronounce name. And it's just, oh, she's American. And so it was, and understanding those different nuances of what it means to be Asian in different countries as well, of Asian heritage. I remember when I was in the UK, an Englishman said, why do Asian Americans always Americanize their names? And that's when I realized that Asians in England, they actually keep their Asian name. And yet the part of that assimilation, at least of my generation, was to have an American name.
It's this whole culture around like, okay, we are here. It was difficult to arrive to this country, and a little bit the American dream, let's say like this. No, probably involved into, okay, my kids need to raise as much as the culture thing, which I suppose in other parts of the world this didn't happen too much. You said something that piqued my attention in there, and it's that during your expat time you were going back and forward to Vietnam because of studies. What were you studying actually? What was your relation to Vietnam at that point of time?
So this is when I was pursuing my PhD research. And so the first year that I lived in Vietnam was just for language studies. So that was a whole year where all I did was study Vietnamese. And then by the end, I realized, wow, my Vietnamese is good enough that I think I can do research in this. And so then my dissertation was a biography of a South Vietnamese communist revolutionary. And so he was born in 1911. He led the 1945 revolution in Saigon against the French. And he was my research topic. And so I kept going back to Vietnam to interview him, to do archival research. So that was the reason why I kept spending a lot of time in Vietnam.
Nice. Sounds a very interesting topic. I think we can do a second episode about that at some point. Can you share some of the cultural adjustments that you have in these different countries that you lived? I suppose it's very different for you to go to a country like UK where the language is still the same, no? Then suddenly somewhere, Vietnam, you said that you were speaking the language. Did you speak French, for example, when you arrived to France?
No. So it was different in each of the countries. And so I think the first time in living in England actually really helped me understand how American I am. And so even with the same language, so for example, I would say, hey, how far is it to get from Cambridge to London? And people would actually tell me in distance. And that's when I realized, oh, Americans think in terms of time. Is it 45 minutes by train? Is it an hour and a half in traffic? Is it, if you take the express bus, how long is it? And I never even thought about how Americans, even though the words are, how far is it? What we're really asking is, how long is it going to take? I actually have no concept of distance. You can tell me this many miles. That doesn't mean anything to me. I just think about how much time is it going to take to get there. And so those were, there was that. I also remember feeling really unattractive in the UK because people don't give eye contact. So when you enter a room, I'm used to people looking up and looking at me. And then, but in the UK, a lot of people it's considered rude to look at people directly in the eye. And so, but that gives that sense of, oh, I'm not, they don't want to look at me. And so, so those are just some of the things that I picked up. I also learned how to keep my knife in my right hand and my fork in my left hand the whole time. So, because in the US, we switch, and that's kind of an efficiency thing too. It's just, I'm going to go with whatever's stronger, which is I'll switch, I'll cut with my knife, and then I'll switch and put the fork in my right hand. And when I was in England, I learned, no, you have to keep your knife in your right hand the entire time.
So the whole politeness part of like do not do it proper British, let's say like this.
Yeah.
I think France also has this kind of also.
Yeah.
I don't know if.
Yes. And so in France, I mean, actually, of all the French I started learning French just before, and so my French was never really that strong. And so, actually, I would have Vietnamese friends in France. Because there's actually a pretty big, because of the colonial history, there's a pretty big Vietnamese community. So in France, I would find myself sometimes speaking in Vietnamese to communicate, or in English, or in. I was able to get into the intermediate level French when I was studying French there, and this is really key actually for anyone who's considering being living abroad. Is if you get into the beginning, that means you're pretty much, especially if you're an English speaker, you're pretty much going to be speaking English. But if you get into the intermediate, it's just your people are coming from really different backgrounds, and there's much more of a chance that I'll be speaking, that you'll be speaking the language that you're learning. And also I was studying at Alliance Française, which was the local school and not one of the fancy private schools. And, oh no, not Alliance Française. It was the local public one, and someone actually lent me his address so I could do that. So I could actually qualify for the cheap version, essentially.
So, without being registered in France, you accessed the public education system. Okay, I got it. Well, if it worked, it worked, no? Like, So in total, how
as a grad student, especially.
In total, how many years were you living abroad then? Like you said, like 4 years in Vietnam, but also like how many years? So
pretty much, from 22 until 28. 29. So I guess that's 7. Yeah. So I spent most of my 20s actually bouncing around and in those different countries.
And mainly because of studies, like it was
mainly because of studies, mainly because I was pursuing my PhD. Okay. And so it was mostly because of research.
Did it influence it a little at all what you are doing currently? Like approach on leadership?
Absolutely. It is absolutely, because I think that what I learned was about adapting. And so I think that there's a particular way of adapting as a minority in the US. And then there is a way of adapting as a foreigner, as an expat. And so, but growing up, I already had this intuitive sense of how to adapt. And yet that was honed even more when I lived abroad. And I think I just noticed things a lot more. I would just notice, for example, in Germany, I've never been a place where the public transportation is always on time. It was just like, how is that possible?
Not anymore.
And that there's, okay. Well, back then, I mean, and also people were very focused on the rules. And so they had that rhyme of no jaywalking. It was something like, some German friends taught me, it was like red man, dead man. You shouldn't cross the street. And so, whereas like in Vietnam, that's very different. People are constantly, there's no sense of traffic laws.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Like I lived 4 years in Germany and now living in Greece. I think Greece is more like Vietnam and Germany. It's very strict in that sense. So yes, I totally relate to the fact of like, but even like you risk really having a fee. Like there is no cars at all and you cross in red. And if by any chance there is a police officer there, they will find you. They will tell you, hey, you crossed in red. And I'm just like, yes, but there's nobody here. So it's just like, this can happen.
So there's
don't cross in red.
There's this whole range because in Vietnam, for example, I mean, it made me realize when living in Vietnam how litigious the US is. So, for example, the way that you drive in Vietnam, because I drove a moped, it's just focus on what's in front of you. Focus what's in front of you, and you trust the people behind you are focused on what's in front of them. And then if there's an accident, the more expensive vehicle is always responsible for paying. Doesn't matter whose fault it is. So I remember getting into an accident with a school kid who basically cycled right into my moped. But because I had the moped and he had the bicycle, I was responsible.
Okay.
And yet in the US, you think about everything is about laws. Well, did you do this? Did you do this? Mm-hmm. Whereas there it's more about different kinds of logic.
I assume like that's also one of the like questions that I wanted to ask you related to this. It's like, how did you overcome like cultural barriers between these different countries that you lived in? Like, because I assume there is a lot of things and a lot of learning in very fast pace. Maybe like you need to learn things fast, no? As in countries that are very different.
I think that the first step is actually accepting it is going to be different and there's no right or wrong. Because I actually would see other expats who would constantly complain, oh, I can't believe the way they do things here. It's not the right way to do it. And it's just different. We have to understand the logic. And so I was actually, I'm really proud of the fact that when I was in Vietnam, I had a lot of local friends. I had a lot of Vietnamese friends. And a lot of other expats didn't have that. They kind of just strictly hung out with the expat community. And I can't say that was always the case. When I was in England, I was really with the international students. Because what I found was the students at Cambridge, they kind of, the English students, I should say, kind of stuck with themselves if they'd gone to undergrad and then went on to grad school at Cambridge. And so it's different in every context. But I think that first is just accepting, hey, I have to adapt. And then practicing curiosity around that. I know, for me, time is really, I'm very much about punctuality. And growing up, my mom was always late. And it really would bother me. And I got a lot of anxiety. And yet when I lived in Vietnam, I really understood it more because in Vietnam, they have this time is rubber. And if you go to a wedding, you can expect everyone's going to be late by an hour and a half. And I remember people would constantly cancel on me last minute. And I would get really irritated because it was just, they must know. How is this constantly happening with different people? And then I talked to a Vietnamese friend and he said, oh, yeah, they know. It's just the reason why they waited to the last minute is because they wanted to make it an emergency. Because if they tell you beforehand, then then they're showing they have to make they're making a choice, and the choice is not to be with you. If they wait until the last minute, they had no choice. And so it's just, so they're trying to be respectful. And it was really getting interested about the logic rather than getting annoyed about it.
That's very interesting. It's just like how cultures approach everything, basic things in life, like meeting a friend for a coffee at the end. Like there is like a very structural way of, if I have something else or I need to define, telling it or the German way, that you lived in Germany also, I suppose you can relate to that. Like talking to someone, can you have a coffee? Oh, yeah, next week, Wednesday, between 7 and 7:30. And okay, I will put it in my calendar.
Follow through.
Yeah, of
right.
course.
It's not
if
just
it's in the calendar, it's in the calendar.
Yes, because in the US, it could even be, especially I'd say in the Pacific Northwest, people can say, we should have coffee. But that's kind of a way of ending a conversation.
Yeah.
And so they don't really mean it. So
Of course. No. That's the typical thing. You find someone that you haven't seen in 3 years in the street, and you say, we should grab a drink someday. You never talk with that person anymore, and that's also like ways of doing. Actually, I also wanted to ask you, because you are now working with leaders of companies, and you work a lot with leadership and how to define leadership. I think you also put curiosity in there, which is also one of the points that we will talk later a little bit more into it. But how did you notice like very different styles of leadership across the countries that you lived in? How did you find this? So
most of the time when I was living abroad, I was in academia. So I'll say put that through the academic lens, first of all, and that has its own culture as well. But I noticed that in England, the way that academics are is much more quiet. Whereas in the US, it's there could be a lot more asserting themselves. I have my strong opinions. I'm this public intellectual. And in the US, I remember there was this one professor he was later knighted. He was just the kind of the highest, a very well respected professor. And yet we would be in these seminars, and then he would just ask one simple question at the end. It wasn't show offy. That's what I realized, that there's this difference. That was one. And then in Vietnam, I would say that it's much more about positional power and deference. There's an assumed deference because of age and because of seniority. And so already in a way, a leader doesn't have to, they earn the respect because of their position already, because the students will already defer to them. And there's all of these, you can't say this, you can say this to someone who is much more senior. Whereas I think in the US, you could have people who are actually much younger, much more junior, but if they've published a lot and they're in the media and they're very vocal, then they could actually be much more, there's almost an element of being a leader also means having to have an entertainer quality to it. And so yes, I would say that those are kind of three how I saw academic leadership in the UK, the US, and in Vietnam. And again, it's not until I go away do I form my opinions of the US, because now I can see it in contrast. I didn't have that sense because it was the water that I swam in, so the air that I breathe.
Makes sense. Maybe entering just a little bit into the second part of the episode, but then we will go out a bit. But I'm curious about, like, do you believe that organizations should benefit or could benefit of integrating other kind of like cultural approaches on leadership into their organizations, like not sticking only with the idea? Of course, international companies, I assume this is something that they work on, because if you have an international leader of a company from Japan, it's different from having it from, I don't know, from Russia, no? And then you need to learn how to navigate these leadership differences in the cultures itself. But do you ever apply what you learned traveling and being an expert in leadership with the people that you work and with the clients that you work on, saying, okay, in this country, they do it like this. Have you tried to apply that a little bit into changing, no, the organizations?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that it's the exact, oh, here they do it like this or here they do it like this. I think it's the underlying, we need to adapt. We need to adapt because that is where whatever context that we're in is sometimes, and I can share more about that later on, but just that the adaptability is what is key to being able to even actually engage in cross-cultural communication. As I mentioned earlier, there were some people who were just, oh, I don't need to adapt. They need to adapt to me. They're doing it wrong. That kind of ethnocentric view. And that is not going to, if you carry that, I mean, I think maybe that was the way that decades ago, but it doesn't work now. It doesn't matter actually if you are a local company or a international company, because there's so much diversity, especially in the US, around workers and where they're coming from. And also generations too.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. No, it's a lot of like, I assume like with the changes and also the world, it's getting more globalized around, like it changed also the way that we access this kind of information. It's not, so you can also adapt to things, even though you are not physically in the place where that thing is happening. And that also can see, you know, like especially, I don't know, I see it with the Japanese culture. A lot of people follows rules of Japanese culture being outside of Japan just because they like the traditions of Japanese culture and this kind of things. It's interesting if you ever applied them like that, but it makes a lot of sense that you grab a little bit like of the pieces that makes it relevant for leadership at the end.
Yes, there's a lot of the lean process, right? Is really from Japan.
Yeah. Can you share any culture shock that you remember? Like, okay, being in some of the countries that you live and saying, okay, this is not what I was expecting at all.
Oh my gosh. I remember in Germany, I was with my partner and his friends, and it was a sunny day, and they were just, I mean, they kind of just stripped and like it was like sunbathing and it was like going topless, and I was just, and it just made me realize how prudish could have just in the US, you're just like, you don't do that. You're not. And also I think in the US, there's certain ideas, there's a lot of body shaming that happens. And so the only people who have the right to bear their bodies are those who have really fit, thin bodies. Whereas what I noticed in Europe and in Germany, there was, hey, it's natural to do this. We can go topless in our own backyards, and it doesn't matter what kind of body you have. Yeah. So I would say that was a big culture shock.
The whole nudist culture of Germany.
Yes,
if you go into the lakes,
in the US, there's a lot more, like there's a lot of discomfort around that, right? Because it's not, it's associated with sexuality, whereas in what I found in Germany is it's just more, this is just the natural, we're being comfortable and open. And so that was one of the big shocks. Another kind of fun one was how much they value bread. Going to a bread shop, they would weigh it as if it's meat. That's how you sell bread, right? And so that was also, it kind of just made me think about, how we sell things can actually show what we value, and that their bread is something that is as precious as meat.
Yeah, I think it's very cultural, and it shows also like when you enter a German bakery and you start seeing different kinds of breads, and you're just like, what's this? Like, what, how, why there is so many different kinds of breads, and why do they taste good? All of them. It's just like, I don't know. I mean, I come from a family that eats always with bread, so that's not something that surprised me too much. But the quantity of bread and the different kinds, and everyone has its own bread for everything, and it's just like, okay, that's a whole different thing, you know. Like we always eat with, I suppose, like French, like with the baguette or with a ciabatta or something.
French
like
don't
that.
weigh their baguettes, right? Because it's just the baguette. It's pretty much in pastries. But in Germany, they have all these different kinds of dark breads, and then another culture shock when I was in Vietnam. And this is actually, I realized there's a difference between being in the South and the North. So for most of my time, I lived in the North in Hanoi, and people would just come by and just drop by without telling you beforehand, just come to visit. And that was a big shock for me because I'm used to, hey, you call, you plan a visit, you give me some notice. I didn't know that you were just going to drop by. And that was actually really liberating once I realized that was the case, because that meant I could just drop by. And I started doing that as well. And so it was actually really liberating to just be, oh, hey, I'm here. Can I have dinner? And so, yeah, that was, once I overcame the shock, it was, I embraced it.
It's also very curious, no? Because at the same time you were saying, okay, they can cancel you in last minute because of this fact of making it an emergency, and then just like respecting that, or not telling you in advance, but then they show up without announcing. So it's very much like the opposite of like, so if you have a schedule thingy, you don't respect the schedule until the last minute and you cancel it. But but showing unadvised,
it's more casual. That's okay. I think it's much more fluid. That all of those boundaries are much more fluid.
Cool. I wanted to ask you about a little bit on like personal recommendations or memories that you had from these times abroad. But let me ask you a last question before we go to that. And it's, how was going back home? Because the repatriation part of expats is something that a lot of people ignores. But when you've lived, like in your case, 7 years abroad, the home that you remember from when you left, normally when you go back, it's not the same one. So how was the going back to the US in your case?
Yes, it was. That's such a great question. I felt that I had changed and so many other people hadn't. And in Seattle, so I came back to Seattle. That's where I grew up. And so Seattle had changed a lot. So there were actually lots of transplants in Seattle, but the local Seattleites, the people who I went to school with, I mean, there were some of them who had lived, who had done studies abroad, but a lot of them hadn't. And so I just felt, wow, my whole worldview is really different. And I think it actually helped me when I came back to Seattle. I started to have really diverse friends from all ethnicities, nationalities, ages, class groups. And I think part of that constantly adapting really helped me. And so I'm actually really proud now of how the diversity of the communities that I feel comfortable being with, and how I can be with very different groups of people. So I think that helped me with coming back. It was just, oh, I can find this here. And so it made me seek it out. And I knew I also had to be really proactive. And also it's always fun to then find even just the global citizens, right, within this community, other people who've lived in different countries as well. And so that was like being the international student in England. It was just, oh, who are other people who've lived? And that forms another community.
Cool. So now just going a little bit into personal recommendations and stuff, like, do you remember any musical or cultural traditions that you still like take from time to time, or that last an impression on you from the countries?
Yes. So I would say for Vietnam is there are many different ethnic minorities in Vietnam, and there's the Museum of Ethnology in Hanoi that actually has the real life models of homes of different ethnic minorities. And so I think that's a really easy way to go and see to experience that. And also if you can, then just actually go to the areas where there are ethnic minorities, because it's the way people dress, the language, what people eat. It's all really different. I still remember my friend taking me. He was an ethnic minority in the mountainous regions, and where you only harvest rice once a year. So in the southern part, you harvest rice twice a year. But when you harvest rice only once a year, the rice is amazing. It tastes so different. All the nutrients, it's as if all the nutrients are there. And I'll never forget that. And so just, I think, go and explore. If you get to Vietnam, is make sure you explore the different regions, go outside the cities.
Cool. I actually wanted to ask you about foods and drinks that you enjoy and that you'll remember with a special love, let's say like this, from the regions you lived in. You already entered in the rice, but maybe there is this like, oh, I missed.
Oh, there's so much food.
This.
I mean, well, and the thing is, growing up, because my parents worked all the time, I didn't actually eat that much Vietnamese food. We had kind of three. We had pizza, we had spaghetti, and we had one Vietnamese pork dish, and I had that constant rotation. And so for me, variety isn't that important yet. So when I lived in Vietnam, that was when I got exposed to all of these different foods, and there are different regional foods as well. So it's So there's so many different foods, and then I think in all of those countries, I discovered Indian food in England. That's what I really loved. The Indian food there is delicious.
Indeed. If UK you need to eat good, you eat Indian or Pakistani normally, but I wouldn't go for fish and chips. But yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, pub food from time to time, it's okay. So I think you already entered a little bit on the recommendations of what you would recommend someone who visits Vietnam, which is like get out of the big cities, explore the rural parts of it. Is there any region of Vietnam that you say, okay, you cannot miss that? Like this is the spot to go, yes or yes, when you go to Vietnam, for example?
I mean, Halong Bay is beautiful. I think it's one of the UNESCO 7 wonders of the world. And so definitely visiting there. Hue is the original royal city, and that's in the central region. And so visiting there is also, I would highly recommend that. And for England, I would actually recommend going to Cambridge and to Oxford. And because I think just going to those, the campuses are so different than American campuses. And you kind of just get the sense of, wow, this is where so much knowledge was created. And so, yeah, I think that's also really a special experience too.
Nice. Are there any books, films, or any resources that you would recommend anyone to read or check or see before going to, I suppose, especially Vietnam, also because you studied about it, but I don't know. I don't know if there is any film that you say, okay, this is historically correct, and this is how how you should learn about the Vietnamese war, for example, and the revolution or communist times.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a little tricky because the South Vietnamese experience outside of Vietnam is quite different from the Vietnamese experience within Vietnam because of the communism in Vietnam, and my family, because I consider myself South Vietnamese. So there was a country called South Vietnam that then lost. And so, I mean, if to kind of understand maybe more of the South Vietnamese perspective, I would actually recommend Journey from the Fall, which is actually about the boat people and prison camp experience. I can't think of any film that I would recommend that's got English subtitles in Vietnamese. I will say that my favorite film is actually a German film, and it is Goodbye Lenin. And you know that film?
Of course.
And I love that film because I think it's, first of all, it's a funny German film, which I think a lot of German films that make it into the not outside Germany are not funny. But I think it really shares the experience of the Berlin Wall falling. And I think that was so transformational for the country. And so I think to watch that, I think people can really get a sense. I mean, I know there are lots of movies around the Holocaust, but I think that's actually when the country became united and all the feelings around that. I think that's a really great way to understand Germany.
Definitely. I really like this movie also. I haven't watched it in a long time, so maybe I will rewatch it soon. With that said, I would say we can jump directly to the second part of the episode. Hey there, everyone. If you're loving this episode so far and you want to stay tuned with other expat experiences, make sure to hit the subscribe button and follow our podcast so you never miss an episode. On top of that, we are now offering one-on-one calls to help you kickstart your own YouTube channel, launch a podcast, or navigate the journey of becoming an expat. Whether you are dreaming of sharing your story with the world or just need some guidance on your expat adventure, we've got you covered. Check the product section on our website, expatexpertspodcast.com, or check the link in the description and book your session today. With that said, let's go back to the episode.
The Expert, fostering curiosity and developing as leaders.
Turning a little bit into work-related relation, you have like living a little with the expat part. So you basically work with leadership development. You try to foster curiosity with organizations and you consult them. So you have a consultancy company, agency, I don't know how to call it, called CuriosityBased. What can you explain a little bit what you do, what work you do?
Yeah, I can describe it. So think so we help people practice curiosity in the world, starting in the workplace, because that's where we spend most of our waking hours. So I say that because a lot of as a business, we make most of our money through working with organizations. And yet we feel actually the real impact is individuals everywhere. And part of the reason why we have this is because I think that we live in a very polarized world, and that there is and especially in the US, there's a sense of right or wrong, true or false. And actually, I think that what my expat experience has, and being also bicultural, helps me understand there is no true or false. There's just different. There's all this nuance, and multiple truths can coexist at the same time. So what we really help people do is appreciate that, because when you can appreciate that, that's actually at the core of empathy and being able to work with one another. And so we approach it from this: how do we practice curiosity? And I think of curiosity as a practice that has these three elements. The first is self-awareness. So how do I be curious about myself? Practice inward curiosity. The second is relationship building. How do I be curious about other people and ask them questions and learn their stories? And how do I share with them my stories? Because they're going to have reactions to my stories. And that back and forth is reciprocity. And that's how we build relationships. And the third is clear communication. How do we share specific examples and stories with one another instead of talking in these generic, vague terms? And so we work with organizations. We've developed all of these different workshops, essentially, that are around organizational culture. So I have a book called 7 Forms of Respect, around goal setting, belonging and inclusion, and communication skills. And so whenever I work with an organization, it's just try to find, what are you struggling with right now? And then it's just, okay, well, let's take you through this. And these are learning experiences. I do not do training. We do not do training, because training is actually, hey, you can test on training. You're communicating knowledge that can be tested. Mm-hmm. So you should train on safety issues on a factory, right? There's a right and wrong there. Maybe different ways of doing it, but what we actually do is encourage people to learn about themselves and learn about one another, and do that in the workplace, because school learning shouldn't stop at school. The workplace can actually employers can actually create their companies into learning organizations where there's continual learning and people feel invested in and they feel that they are growing. Mm-hmm. And if that doesn't happen, then people may come to the workplace and they feel, oh, my labor is being extracted, right? I'm only coming here to do the thing that I'm good at, to make you money. And it's a very transactional relationship. And yet I think a lot of people actually want to feel invested in. They want to feel that they can grow, and then they'll give more to their organization if they feel that.
I see. So it's not only, you would not consider that coaching anyway either. Like it's not either training, neither coaching. It's more like how do you define it? How you frame it? Like,
I mean, we just, because what I like to do is come in, we'll take them through learning experiences, come in, shake things up, and then get them thinking. And then there could be a team coach who comes in later on, or maybe they've learned how to do it themselves. So because I meant with consulting and with coaching, it's much more customized, right? It's much more, and I'm going to be with you and take you through all of these conversations. For me, the way that we work, it's much more. So if you think about other companies like Franklin Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Speed of Trust. We come in, we do our learning experiences, we help people see things that they can't currently see, and then we give them tips and resources. This is how you continue to do it on your own. So that's how the business works. I'm not there for this long engagement with them. I'm there for these periods of time to help them practice and to give them some tools. And yet I actually believe that they can do that themselves if they make the time. So we don't need to be with them all the time, as long as they're saying, okay, we learned some things. Now we got to go. It's just, if you think about we think of it more if we're a boot camp. Hey, let's show you some moves, and then you can go and do this by yourself. And then there are some people who just know, I'm only going to exercise if I go in with my trainer. We don't do that. It's just, no, you can actually do this by yourself. And we don't think that's the best use of our time too, to keep doing this again and again and watching you. Trainers are very important. And yet that's not what we do.
Okay.
It's more
so
of a
it's
showing.
More like a consulting.
And like in the starting, starting the conversations.
Okay.
Because a lot of times people don't make time for the learning together. They know it's a good thing to do. They know it's a good thing to have conversations with one another. But we create the initial space to do it. And then we even say, we're going to assign you a partner so you can continue to do it on your own. And then they're just, okay, I have homework. Okay, I can do this. I've started the conversation. This feels good. So it's, we think of it as we start the process for them.
So it's a kickstarting of the whole thing that then they can continue on their own as an organization or as a team. How much of the work that you do is focused? Because when I check your website, for example, and I was reading about what you do and how do you work with it, it talks a lot about leadership. But do you work always with the leaders? The word leader is difficult to define.
Yeah, I know. Everyone's a leader. And so, I mean, leadership development is also just, it's an easy way for people to understand this. We've worked with leadership teams. We also work with, I actually really enjoy when we can come in and do it with the whole organization. And maybe we're doing it in groups. And so, and because that way everyone it's creating the sense of, I can learn, the CEO can learn from someone who's the intern. And we're all learning from one another because we just have different perspectives. And this is kind of just tying back to the expat part and living abroad. It's just, we can all be learning from one another just by seeing how different we are. And so that's what we really try to get people to do, to appreciate that there are differences. And so even, for example, I have a book called 7 Forms of Respect. It's just, we can agree how respect feels, to feel seen, heard, acknowledged, appreciated. We disagree on what does it look like? What does it look like? So for example, I said in England, I'd get people not looking me in the eye. And that's not disrespectful. It's just, they're considering that respectful. And so to move away from, because I think that there's this right now, a binary of disrespectful, respectful. And I don't think I think it's just like, there's lots of different ways to show respect. And that's what we help people appreciate, which actually is pretty radical to see, there can be different ways. And I also want to be very clear. And then there's illegal. I'm not saying anything if you are bullying someone or assault, or that's against the law. So that's not about disrespect. That's a different category.
Yeah. Why 7? That's It's one of the questions that I had in my mind. Like, you have a book, so let's talk about the book first. Like, you have a book called Seven Forms of Respect. It's a guide, basically, as far as I understood, to find these ways of like dealing with what you just were saying, like what is respect from a different perspective and what can be disrespectful. No, why using this number 7? What is the magic behind the number 7?
Yeah. So first, I just want to say, because one of the big misconceptions about the book is that you should do all 7. It's not that case. It's more of these are 7 forms, and I'm going to prioritize these 2, and the other, there's some that I'm like, I'm okay with, and others like I don't like at all. I don't think of that as respectful. So I want to be really clear. It's not about getting all 7. For those of your listeners who know 5 love languages, think about it more like 5 love languages, not like 7 habits of highly effective people. Okay. So to answer your question, actually at first I started with 6, and they weren't the same 7 that we have now. And it was actually, so I had a hypothesis that there were 6. And so I started doing research and focus groups. And then there were 7 that emerged. And I also want to be really clear. We're not strict on these 7, because the purpose isn't to say you are this type. This is what you always want. Because we actually think of respect as dynamic, as relative, as subjective, and it's contradictory, and it changes depending on the context. So the way that I want respect might be different when I'm with my boss versus with my peer versus with someone who reports to me. And it might be different if I'm talking to a customer versus a vendor, right? And it could also be different if I'm talking to my parent versus my brothers. And so versus my friends. So it's constantly dynamic. And that's one of the things that, so 7 forms of respect is actually about getting curious about respect. Okay. It's getting curious that why it's changing. Why is it changing? Let me try to understand what makes it change so people can understand the context. So, but going back to your why 7, so that's the research. We went back to that. And I also tell people, look, if none of these 7 resonate with you, that's okay. What does? How do you want respect? How do you want to get respect? How do you want to show it? The point isn't to be, oh, these are the 7. They're not like rules. It's more, the purpose is more, oh, there are different ways. So even with the love languages, I've heard people say food is my love language. Food was not one of the original 5 love languages, right? And so, so however people, I mean, I dream one day people say, what are your forms of respect? These are my forms. And you know what that means? We want to respect one another. We assume that we do. We just do it differently. And that's different from you need to respect me. That's how we talk about respect now. You need to respect me versus how do you want respect?
Okay, so it's analyzing respect from not taking the assumption that everyone feels the same on or on how they perceive respectful manners. And I suppose a lot of this also comes relation with multicultural work or teams or people, like how much of this also touches things like, I don't know, diversity, inclusion, equity in the sense, no? Because I suppose that the fact that there is so many forms or different forms of respect is also binded to having different cultures, different kind of people inside of it. It's extracted out of this research also, or?
Yeah, well, and the research is, and the approach is fundamentally, we as an individual, we make our own choices and we have our own influences. And so I try to be really, because some people say, well, how do women want respect? How does this group want respect? And it's just, there's no group that's monolithic, right? I mean, you can have general, what I was saying in Vietnam, time is rubber, but there are a lot of people who care about time. Just because you're Vietnamese doesn't mean that you think that time is rubber, right? It just means that generally there's this acceptance that we can be more flexible with time. And as an individual, I may say, that's not acceptable to me. I would never do that. Or I don't like that. And so the work is actually trying to get clear about asking people, what do you want? Because a lot of times what we discovered, we are all brought up to think respect should be this, should be that. And what we don't ask ourselves is, how do I want what matters to me? How do I want to be respected? What actually matters to me so much? I will do it no matter what, even if it doesn't matter to other people. And so to get some clarity around that, because so it's a lot of that goes back to the self-awareness part of practicing curiosity. So yes, all these different cultures can affect it, and yet we also belong to multiple cultures, communities, and identities at the same time. So which one is going to be more important? I can't say that being Vietnamese is the most important. Sometimes it's being the firstborn child is the biggest part of what's influencing how I think about respect, right? Yeah. Or being an employer is that's what's really strong for me. Or growing up in the Pacific Northwest, or so, it's about being able to name it. Hey, this is what's influencing me right now.
Totally. I think any kind of relation establishes some kind of marks, no, and some kind of ways of doing things that might come from cultural perspective, but from work or from family or from everything. So makes a lot of sense.
Being in a small business versus a big corporation.
Absolutely.
Being in a military. There are people who are like, I grew up in the military, or I served in the military. That influences how people think about respect. And so then to be able to share so that other people can understand, oh, this is where you're coming from. Now I understand why you want that.
It's so the only thing. So this is a framework that you do. It's the only thing that you do with these companies, because curiosity can open thousands of things. No, that's the whole point, I assume, of curiosity itself. One of them being, how do you respect each other and how do you respect yourself? Do you enter, for example, on more tangible things, or like, I don't know, like, because this is a little bit like soft skills, no? What we are talking about, it's okay, how to respect others. Maybe I want to learn how to appreciate myself a little bit more, and that's through curiosity I can arrive to that. Do you also have like clients who are more like, okay, curiosity should trigger that I want to learn this skill. I want to learn something very specific. Like, I don't know, I want to learn Photoshop. That's the first thing that came to my mind.
So that, I think learning Photoshop goes into training, right? And so, I mean, so one of the great things as being a business owner is I can say, oh, I do this and I don't do this. And I can refer you, if you want to Photoshop, let me introduce you to someone who does Photoshop. We don't do Photoshop. So 7 Forms of Respect is kind of the signature work that we do. And yet we also, though everything that we do is underpinned by this practice of curiosity. So for example, another one we do, I said goal setting. And so another one is explore what success looks like and feels like to you. And so again, that kind of gets at that communication. Some people think of success in terms of tangible, measurable. It's just like, success looks like making this much money and having a retirement home and having this kind of car. And other people think success means freedom. It means connection. And the way when we talk about success, we're using these different words. And so what we help people understand is both are important. We should talk about tangible and intangible. It's because again, it kind of goes back to, what I said, disrespect versus respect. This is tangible is important. No, intangible is important. Both are important. We just have to, and how do we also be aware? Some people think about it in terms of feelings and some people think about it in terms of tangible, and we need to have both and they need to be in alignment. So that's just another example of what we do around curiosity. Another thing, this is actually, I think works really well with the expat, is we have something called getting curious about our assumptions. Getting curious about our assumptions. And so I think a lot of people, I've seen a lot of trainings that say, don't make assumptions. Assumptions are bad. That's not our approach. Our approach is we all make assumptions. So let's get curious. Let's try to figure out where they come from and actually embrace them and be surprised by them. And kind of be delighted by that surprise. I think of, those nesting dolls, those Russian nesting dolls. You lift a doll and there's another doll and you lift that doll and there's another doll. And that's the way we think of assumptions. They're like those nesting dolls. I didn't know that assumption existed. And now I can break it down, but there's another one. Wait a minute. What's that one about? And I mean, I can give you a coloring book. We can give a whole group of people coloring books and everyone's going to color it differently. And that's based on our experiences. And so what we try to help people do is explain, oh, well, this is why I chose these colors. This is why I chose to make my house look like this. So that's, or draw the house like this. And so that's another, it's all around practicing curiosity and giving people a space to say, it's okay that I think that there's no right. There's just different.
Nice. How do you see all of this fitting, or what is your vision for curiosity playing a role in the future of organizations and leadership in general? What is your ambition? What is with all the project vision for it?
Yes, I hope that we can help organizations become learning organizations. That there is, because we spend most of our time at work. We spend more time with our coworkers than with our family. And like I said earlier, learning does not stop when we graduate from school. And so my vision is to help to move away from, don't get me wrong. Some things we need to be trained in, right? But there's also a lot of space for embracing different perspectives. And then so if we can get into that learning mindset, then we can actually have a more productive, more creative and more accepting place too, because I want to feel good at work. Most people actually, they will, if they like the people they work with, even if they don't like the job, they will stay. And they will leave jobs they love if they don't like the people they work with.
Absolutely.
And so the way and because we spend so much time at work, and part of that liking one another is actually learning from one another. Do I feel that I am growing and stretching here? Or do I feel, and then there are some people who just know work is work. I'm only here to make money. Okay, that's up to you. But there are other places though. I think that there are a lot of people who are just, no, I want to feel that I can do my best, learn here and teach other people. People think that I can teach them too. And that's for any position. I just gave a keynote for the International Association of Administrative Professionals. So these are people, the executive assistants, the administrative professionals. Sometimes people think, oh, you have a low title. Yet they know so much. And if you spend time with any administrative professional, you will see how much you can learn from them. So, and it's just recognizing all work has dignity and that we can all learn from one another. That's my dream, that people feel. I think that a lot of leaders will say curiosity is valued, and yet we've seen stats that just the leaders say that, and yet employees don't feel that. 70% of people don't feel comfortable asking questions at work.
Yeah. It's a lot related, I assume, also to this kind of structures of hierarchy. Do you work with these kind of things? It's part of your work to try to make things a little bit more transversal in that sense, or at least to empower that lower decision makers have also more voice inside of the organizations that you work with.
Yeah, and I think that hierarchy by its very nature is not bad. It's just about clarity. And part of that is actually because of my culture, because hierarchy is baked into the language in Vietnamese. And I think that what's bad is when people abuse it or they're lazy with it. Oh, only this or this. And so so this is where actually we help leaders model practicing curiosity, saying, I don't know. Can you help me do this? Or admitting mistakes in front of people, letting maybe the intern run the meeting, or sharing that responsibility of facilitation. So there are ways to share that and to move it from just talking about it, theoretical, to actually doing it.
Makes a lot of sense. It's not always on destructuring structures. No, it's about making them a little bit more working together, approach.
Yeah, and I also feel that it's not just the leader's responsibility. It's a lot of responsibilities with the leader, and yet it's not 100%. So I like to use the analogy of the classroom. The teacher can say, be kind to each other. And yet there's the playground and there are bullies, right? And then there are the kids who are watching and they don't want to get bullied, so they don't say anything. And then there are the kids who stand up to the bully. And so and that's outside of what the teacher can see. And so there's a lot of things that, yes, there's a lot of influence that leaders have, but they don't have all the influence. It's actually up to individuals to say. So for example, I've seen people say, oh, especially in say, sometimes with training where it's just, I've seen this with with diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And someone will ask, why are we doing this again? I want to understand. And then other people go, oh, I can't believe he's asking that question. That's like a dumb question. And then other people see that and they're like, oh, I shouldn't ask a question. That I shouldn't ask a question. And so what's that signaling, right? And that's outside the instructor, because the instructor or the leader has said, this is important for us to do. And so there's a lot of power among peers. And we actually all have a choice to, instead of saying, oh, I can't believe you did that, or I can't believe you said that, should judge people. It's just like, I want to actually learn what your intention was.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense, like that you are also like not always considering who is on top as a decision maker, that your peer, it's also like, I assume it's also with this example, for example, it's also about like, okay, if someone is not understanding something or someone needs to repeat or re-ask for that, it's totally fine. No, I mean, it's also like,
yeah, we don't go,
where's the background?
They weren't paying attention, or what was that?
How do you personally stay curious? How do you continue to learn, grow, and like being a leader yourself and a consultant yourself? So what is your approach to use? Do you use your own framework yourself?
Yeah.
Let's say like this.
So I process a lot with different friends. And so whenever I'm facing something, I actually will talk to a lot of different people about it. And it's through that processing that I'm practicing that inward curiosity. This is the way I'm feeling about it. And I'll ask, how would you see this? What do you think? Typically, I'm not asking for advice. I'm asking for, how would you interpret this? Which is different from advice. And so, because with advice, that can be tricky, because if someone gives you advice and you don't take it, then there could be issues with it. But if you could say like, hey, how would you interpret this? If you were me, how would you see this? And then I get to see how they would interpret. And sometimes people help me see things. Oh, I wouldn't have seen it that way, which is also different from, I'm not asking for validation. Like, oh, isn't that horrible? Yeah, that is horrible. It's just, no, I'm asking you, what is that? What does that mean? So I'll give you an example. This is where I'm constantly having to practice it myself, because it is a practice. I remember I had a client who asked me for something, and the way that I read the ask, I was really offended. And I actually even kind of sent back a little snarky, like, well, I'm trying to understand why you would ask that. And then I talked to a friend about this, and I said, this is what happened. Can you just, what do you think how would you read this situation? And she said, why don't you just ask them what they meant? Oh, ask them what they meant. Okay. And so I went back and she's like, can you clarify your request? And it turns out their request was very reasonable. But I had all these ideas of what they were asking. And so and that just happened maybe a year or two ago. And so my point here is, even I'm practicing it, and I have to slow down and I have to pause. And so the way that I practice curiosity in my own life is I have lots of conversations. Like what I was saying earlier, I'm really lucky that I have a really large network of friends who I can just reach out to. Another way is I love reading, and I love reading fiction. I'm a huge, and historical fiction is my favorite genre, because I love doing not just space travel, but time travel as well. And so that helps me get curious. And so whenever I'm reading, I want to find out more. What was this? What was this? And it helps me also. In fiction, you can get people's internal feelings. I can feel it. Whereas with nonfiction, if it was just a straight up history book, I wouldn't get that. I would get more of the, this is what happened, these are why. So that's another way that I practice curiosity too.
Very nice. I think the fiction part, it's incredible. I play a lot of video games that are mainly fictional, but majority of them, and that also triggers sometimes like, okay, I feel sometimes like, oh, wow, okay, I'm discovering this new world or I'm discovering this new place, and then suddenly I'm like, why am I feeling the same that the the character of the video game is feeling? No, like, why am I like suddenly having the emotion of like I lost a friend? It's just a video game. I didn't lose this friend. Why am I having this? No, and how you tackle that situation, or even getting angry sometimes. Like, why I'm getting angry to this? Like, why I'm to the situation that it's not real at all? And I assume that's also part of like discovering how you will deal in these situations that are not something that you will live eventually. No. The last question that I have for today would be like, what are some of the most rewarding aspects of the work that you do with CuriosityBased and with your framework?
So I will say two. So there's with our customers, and then there's with our external customers, and then with our internal customers. And so with our external customers, I whenever we're working with a client and we see that aha, and we see them say, "Oh, I'm responsible for this too. Maybe I wasn't having maybe I need to change my expectations, or I need to have this conversation." And so that's always such a joy for me when they're just, oh, respect is relative. Oh, or oh, it's just, we are coming from different places. And when they have an aha about themselves, oh, I care about this because of this, and I didn't know that. So, and especially with our clients, we work with a lot of government clients and a lot of nonprofits. And so we know that if we can help them be strong, then they're able to better do the work for their stakeholders, which is typically the public, and organizations that need their support. So that's for the external side. For the internal side, I have a small team. We're 5 people. I get a lot of joy from being a group of learn-it-alls. We are actually also very, very diverse too. There's most of us are immigrants or children of immigrants who've lived in different countries as well, and so I get a lot of joy from us growing together, and it really drives and motivates my work, because I was an employer from the get-go. So even when I started my company 3.5 years ago, I was never alone. I always I'm going to invest, and I'm going to have other people with me. And for us we all have this goal of adding more narratives, more diverse narratives to leadership development. And so that's also what I get a lot of joy from.
Very nice. Julie, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. It was a very, very enlightening conversation and episode. I'm 100% sure that a lot of our listeners will take many lessons, valuable lessons out of it. Thanks for your time. Maybe the last question, of course, like CuriosityBased has a website, so it's out there if you want to check company-wise, but maybe where people can find you, connect with you, and even like maybe your book, where can people buy it?
Yes.
Also, that's an important part.
Yeah. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share. So if you want to learn more about my company, go to curiositybased.com. You can go to formsofrespect.com if you want to learn more about my book. And we also have a free mini book, a quiz, and a digital course people can do as well. And you can buy the book on Amazon or anywhere, Barnes & Noble, anywhere that there are booksellers. You can just special order it. And then I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn. And that's where I post the most. I also have a pretty active YouTube channel where we do quick tips every week. And so this could actually be really helpful for those who are expats in the US. Just how do I navigate? And so we have lots of videos on, say, hey, 5 ways to set your boundaries, or how to give feedback, how to give constructive feedback. And so I have a lot of those on our YouTube channel. And so that's at CuriosityBased. And you can find me on LinkedIn, and also follow the CuriosityBased LinkedIn as well. And we have a weekly newsletter where we just talk about practicing curiosity. It's not salesy. I promise. It's just ways of seeing the world differently. And I also bring in a lot of my background and experience into those stories too. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
The pleasure is all mine to have you, and I will put all the links on the description of the episodes on all social media and YouTube also. So if you want to know more about Julie and the work that they are doing, go and check them out. Of course, to all the listeners, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Expat Experts. And until next time, stay curious and take care.
You've been listening to Expat Experts, the podcast that takes you around the world through the stories of those who've lived it. Subscribe now to YouTube and your favorite podcast platform, and stay tuned for more inspiring interviews.